A lot of my work is influenced by the work of the French sociologist Luc Boltanski. Boltanski describes what he does sometimes as the sociology of critique. So rather than doing critical sociology, studying the critiques which make up social and economic life, trying to understand regimes of power, regimes of political economy in terms of the forms of judgment, the forms of critical capacity which are internal to them. And some of you will be familiar with his book with Yves Chiapello, The New Spirit of Capitalism, which approaches management theory by looking at the forms of critique which are internal to it. And what I want to do today is think about neoliberalism as a critique of the very idea of the social. This has already come up quite a lot over the last couple of days, so there's going to be quite a few resonances with some of the previous papers. But also to understand the present moment of neoliberalism in terms of the ways in which it's reached the limit to that critique and the ways in which it's had to accept aspects of sociality, elements of the social, which it's had to kind of readmit in certain respects. And just as Boltanski looks at how capitalism renews itself partly by drawing on the energies and moral philosophies of its critics, one of the things I'm going to argue is that neoliberalism at this present moment is doing the same in relation to the idea of the social. Now, at a sort of rhetorical level, we see Friedrich Hayek as an old man at the dawn of the neoliberal era, describing the very term social as a weasel word that didn't mean anything. It simply obscured more meaningful categories and probably obscured the real intentions of the person who was using the term. If we then flick forward to the sort of heady days of the late 90s, Nicholas Rose, the British Foucauldian sociologist, wrote a very influential paper in Economy and Society, which Hayek no doubt would have been delighted to see, arguing that the term social was losing its hold over our imaginations. This was actually, I think, one of the most cited papers in Economy and Society. Now, if we flick forward again to the present day, I think Hayek would be rather disappointed once more. We see a kind of explosion of the weasel word all around us. Most of these terms people will be familiar with. A lot of them are kind of to do with accounting and forms of management and so on. Just for those who don't know, social prescribing is the practice. It's a growing area, which a lot of hopes are invested in, of doctors recommending that people do things like go dancing, go singing, change aspects of their social lives rather than do things in relation to their bodies. Social neuroscience, which Nicholas Rose has written about recently, claiming is a fantastic opportunity for sociology going forward, is a field pioneered by a guy at Chicago called John Cacioppo, which aims to analyze brains on a social and neurochemical level simultaneously. Anyway, so there's a lot of, the weasel word is back in various ways, and there are kind of a couple of obvious responses to this. One would be a kind of optimistic response, which would be that this is evidence of some kind of Polanyian double movement, that neoliberalism was a huge disembedding of the market from society, and now we're seeing a kind of re-embedding, rather as Polanyi sees going on following the long depression of the 1870s and 80s. A kind of pessimistic argument, which I'm sure some people in this room would have some belief in, would be that this is actually just a kind of jargon, really, and that this is just obscuring existing processes of capital accumulation and economic rationality, and this is not really to be taken seriously on any level. What I want to try and do is to say, well, what would it mean to take this seriously as examples of a new mode of neoliberalism, a kind of not post-crisis mode, but a kind of crisis-delaying mode of neoliberalism. I mean, we shan't go into the sort of question of has neoliberalism had a crisis or not, but I think there's interesting questions about why is it that neoliberalism hasn't had more of a crisis, and partly that is to do with the ways in which it's appropriated some of these logics. Now, I have a definition of neoliberalism. This is actually just something taken from a paper I had in Theory, Culture and Society from earlier this year. Which is that neoliberalism is the elevation of market-based principles and techniques of evaluation to the level of state-endorsed norms. And this chimes partly with what Werner Bonefeld was saying yesterday about the ordoliberals, of the market police, the attempt to fuse together sovereign powers with market institutions, making the market a sphere of legality. You have to go to the market. You're obliged to compete in a market as a matter of legal principle. And that's something which Foucault's lectures focus on quite a lot, is the ordoliberal example of how the state and the market are kind of fused together into a single regime of government and economic power. But I think it isn't so relevant to my paper, but I think I'm going to sort of throw it in for because it's sort of relevant to the rest of the conference, I suppose, is I think it's also worth recognising quite how much of what we're talking about in relation to neoliberalism at this conference isn't market. It's actually market-based techniques and principles. When you talk about something like the REF, there is an effort to try and make people behave in a market-like fashion, but not actually to be in markets as such. At least, I think this is an important distinction. And when you think about things like new public management in public administration, this is making public management more market-like, more enterprising in its ethos and its behaviours, but not actually necessarily a privatisation. And that might sound like a sort of rather sort of vague, sort of obscure distinction, but I think it has some important implications for what neoliberalism is and how it works. And of course, also, as Werner Bonefeld said yesterday, this fusion of economics and sovereignty has been taken to whole new heights by the recent financial crisis, where you see sovereignty becoming a form of underwriting, provides the underwriting for the entire financial economy. You see things like economists being appointed unelected prime ministers of Italy and Greece, and there's this sort of, the fusion of economics and sovereignty is taken to a whole new level and becomes explicit. Now, what does this have to do with the idea of the social? Foucault argues also in his lectures on neoliberalism that the social arises as a distinct problem or sphere of human activity under liberal governmentality, not neoliberal governmentality, but liberal governmentality in the 18th and 19th century, precisely because the fusion of juridical logic of the state and the economic logic of the market cannot work. These are two different forms of subjectivity. These are two different logics, two different ontologies of human activity, where one achieves a form of cooperation through coercion, and the other achieves a sort of spontaneity through a kind of individual rationality, individual calculus and cost-benefit analysis. And that Foucault's argument is that the social arises as a distinct sphere and a distinct set of problems in the 18th century, at least in the modern liberal sense, because as a way of mediating between these two forms of rationality and these two forms of subjectivity. So in a sense, in terms of what is the social, I mean, I'm not going to actually try and define the social, but I think one thing that's important to say about the social in relation to this definition is, firstly, that it often comes by negative forms of definition, that it's something which is not enacted by the state, and it's something which is not simply explicable in terms of individual spontaneous action and rationality. And you see this in how welfare economics, neoclassical welfare economics, speaks of the social as an externality, something which somehow evades other logics. It's a spillover in certain respects. Jacques Donzelot, in his work on the rise of society or social policy in the 19th century, sees the social and social policy as problems which somehow cannot be contained in some other way. So there's this kind of spillover effect. And there's also a kind of contradiction here, that the social, when we talk about social activity, we talk about forms of activity in which human beings are both rule-bound and spontaneous and free at the same time. This is the kind of core contradiction. You see this in Rousseau's theory of the general will. You see it in Kant's theory of the categorical imperative, that it is possible to be free and to obey rules at the same time. And this is the kind of contradiction between a kind of sovereign rationality and a market rationality, which explains what the social is. Now, how much time? Okay. What's that?
Yeah, 7 minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to briefly talk about two periods of the development of neoliberalism to where we are today. This is rather a kind of crude periodization, but roughly speaking, what I want to talk about a little bit is some aspects of the early point of neoliberalism between 1920, when Ludwig van Mies published his paper on socialist calculation, attacking socialist calculation, 1946, which is a kind of cut-off in the development, because it's when Henry Simons commits suicide in Chicago, which leads to a whole different takeover of the different characterization of the Chicago School of Economics. And then jump right forward to the present to think about how have the critical capacities that were developed during this early period, how was the critique of the social, in what ways has it reached its limits, and in what ways has it had to sort of had reached some kind of accommodation with the social. Now, it's important, I think, when you look at who the neoliberals were kind of up against in the 1920s and 1930s, Mies and Hayek, who they were developing a critique of. And in relation to Mies, I'm talking mainly about his critiques of socialism and his essay on socialist calculation. And in Hayek, I'm talking more about papers from the 1940s on the nature of knowledge and the nature of social science and the nature of the socialist state. But what's interesting about the socialists who they were arguing with, such as Oskar Lange and Otto Neurath and others, is that they clearly had quite a lot of sort of modernity on their side. They had all of the kind of techniques that had developed and the institutions from the late 19th century onwards all seem to point towards the inevitable future of a socialist planned economy. And in this respect, Hayek and Mies had very few natty new techniques and gadgets to draw on. In fact, they were appealing to the old market, which at the time seemed a rather a sort of forlorn thing to be arguing in favour of. It's important to just a few points of difference. Lange argues that prices are just the terms on which alternatives are offered. So all forms of data potentially can be understood as prices, which completely alters the nature of the role of markets in society and the need to have markets. You can have things which act like markets, but not actually markets. Statistics are absolutely crucial in the papers that are being published by the socialists at this time in terms of enabling planning boards to understand use values directly rather than having to go via the exchange values, which are the prices on the market. And interestingly, you have the rise of the corporation in the late 19th century, the German and American corporations, which were seen as clear exemplars of how non-market forms of organisation could be more efficient than market forms of organisation, because corporations were managed by a professional class. They could use various sort of behavioural techniques to try and distinguish who should be a manager and who shouldn't. And the corporation became a model for what a socialist society might look like. The critique of the social, and of course I'm sort of brushing very quickly over things here. There's a number of dimensions to it. Firstly, that it lacks the social world, the non-market forms of valuation lack their own forms of commensuration, if you like. There is no intrinsic mode of measurement and valuation to forms of social valuation. Therefore, they have to be imposed upon the social world from without. You can have an economy, you can have a market without any economics, and you can have a state without any political theory. But you cannot have, as far as Mies and Hayek were concerned, the problem of the social is that it lacks its own internal forms of valuation and measurement and comparison. And therefore, you end up relying on these static representations of the social as produced by statistics, which, in terms of the alliance between statisticians and social scientists, creates the form of socialist state that Hayek and Mies were worried about. So in terms of this kind of contradictory nature of the social, as simultaneously sort of some sitting between the logic of the state and the logic of the individual, between the logic of rules and the logic of spontaneous autonomy, Mies and Hayek could only see that the social was ultimately simply a projection of the state's imagination. There could be no reality to society other than as produced by statistics and as produced by things like sociology and ultimately as envisaged by states. And Hayek's papers from the 40s are all about the dangers of intellectuals working for, or some of there's one or two which are about the dangers of intellectuals working for states and allowing their subjective impressions to be sort of projected across everybody else. Now, so the question is today, to what extent does how has this critique of the social run into the ground? Or rather, and if the social has made some kind of return, what kind of return has it made? And I think I want to argue that the current moment of neoliberalism and the possible crisis of neoliberalism, or at least its limits, can be understood partly through a discovery that individual calculation also has social dimensions. the critique that the neoliberals made was that the social was only explicable as an aggregate, as a peer to the state. But the current moment of neoliberalism is a rediscovery of the social as a form of externality that goes on around the individual and around individual calculation. And you see this particularly in these three areas. So firstly, behavioral economics, which is obviously a rapidly expanding area of economics at the moment, effectively argues that individual preferences and norms of calculation are socially embedded and are socially and normatively governed in certain ways, which completely pulls the rug out from under much of neoclassical economics, but also quite a bit of the approach that someone like Mies was taking in the 1920s. Secondly, the price mechanism is a bad proxy for utility, relying on price to access utility. Going via exchange value to get to use value does not work in certain respects. And this is what happiness economics is in many ways demonstrating. And then finally, the theorists of performativity, so the people like social studies of finance and others, argue that economics is itself a type of institution. It is a material and institutional process which is at work in things like trading floors, financial institutions and financial markets. And this is actually recognised by regulators now and central banks. People like Andy Haldane, working for the Bank of England, are actually in dialogue with people like Donald Mackenzie, the performativity scholar, trying to think about how can we stop models behaving in this kind of destructive social fashion. There's a recognition that models have a social life of their own. This also aggregates up. This isn't simply about individual calculation going wrong in terms of in ways that generates costs for individuals making mistakes. The neoliberals were fine with individuals making mistakes and paying for them. But I think one of the things that I think is interesting in terms of the rediscovery of the social is via the psychological, via the individual, but this does aggregate up to create types of social cost and types of, if you like, resistance of a form, a form of withdrawal that is certainly for European once social democratic states is which have public health systems is absolutely disastrous for how for the plausibility of neoliberalism as a mode of government without any concept of the social. I probably don't have time to go. I was just going to talk a bit about social-ish calculation of the present. I mean, I think there's some interesting things going on at the moment in terms of efforts which are going on in relation to social analytics, big data, and efforts to try and get to use values directly. You get these projects such as the Hedonometer project, which is measuring happiness on Twitter, things like sentiment analysis, trying to understand how direct assessments of value, not mediated by price, are interacting with the price system, which in a sense throws the whole notion of Polanyian notion of how markets are embedded in society, throws a very different spin on it, because no longer is the social sort of the nice, warm, fuzzy society that markets might be embedded in. Possibly markets are being embedded in a very sort of technical version of the social in this way. And you get these kind of, strange projects which... I'm actually doing this at the moment as a sort of piece of ethnographic exercise, and it's been zapping me during the conference to find out how I'm feeling. You get techniques of group psychology, which were obviously very influential in early HR and management in the 1930s, which also scale up hugely. This is Jacob Moreno's early sociometry from 1934, from Who Will Survive, but digitize it and you get this huge scaling up and this kind of emergent notion of the social, which people like Roger Burrows and Mike Savage in their paper on the coming crisis of empirical sociology address. What does it mean for sociology if society does come back, but no longer comes back in a guise that is dependent on things like surveys and sociology? I should probably start. Can I just finish?
Very quickly, yeah.
Very quickly. Okay. I mean, just finally, I have a paper from last year called The Emerging Neo-Communitarianism, which tries to sort of theorize some of this as well, about how techniques of community and techniques of the social are kind of complementing neoliberal techniques. That's about how, in a sense, sort of teleological ethical rationality is becoming reinserted into neoliberalism in ways that would have appalled someone like Hayek, to try and distinguish that which is a good choice from that which is a bad choice, which was specifically what Hayek didn't want. I'm going to close on this second point, which is about the importance of repetition to organisations. I want to argue that neoliberalism has become repetitive in a very specific sense. And this is something that Boltanski says, the point of repetition, the repetition's only role in institutions is to make visible the fact that there is a norm by deploying it in a sense for its own sake without it being given any external function. And I think when you think about what things like credit rating agencies are currently doing, auditing, the accounting profession, it's almost like we no longer believe the judgments that are being made about reality. They no longer hold credibility, but they're being repeated simply to try and delay some genuine sense of crisis. And that's, in a sense, when calculation becomes a social phenomenon and becomes understood as a social phenomenon, then it also becomes a ritual. And once it becomes a ritual, then you understand that you are simply performing it because it's a ritual. You're no longer performing it in order to achieve any objective or independent judgment of reality that might hold as valid for anybody else. So that's where I'm going to stop.